The radio crackled at 3:47 hours and every controller in the Tactical Operations Center stopped breathing. The voice that came through wasn't asking for permission. It wasn't requesting clearance. It was stating a fact, cold and certain as winter steel. Home plate, this is Reaper 1 actual. I'm coming in hot, hydraulics gone, right engine smoking, fuel critical. Clear the deck or don't. I'm landing in 90 seconds. The tower chief, a 20-year veteran named Kowalski, felt his coffee mug slip from his fingers. It shattered on the floor, brown liquid spreading like a prophecy no one wanted to read. He knew that call sign. Everyone knew that call sign. But Reaper 1 Actual had been declared missing in action 72 hours ago, deep in the Kandahar Valley, where the mountains ate radio signals and spit out wreckage. The search and rescue teams had found nothing but scorched earth and shrapnel. The colonel had held a briefing that morning, his face gray as ash, and said the words no commander wants to say. We're not getting her back. Yet here she was, announced only by static and the distant thunder of a dying turbofan engine cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Kowalski grabbed the radio with shaking hands. Reaper 1 Actual, say your status. How many souls on board? The response came back clipped, emotionless, professional to the bone. One, just me, and whatever's left of this bird. The A-10 Thunderbolt that materialized out of the smoke-thick sky looked like something pulled from a nightmare. The titanium bathtub that protected the cockpit was scorched black, pockmarked with bullet impacts that had somehow not penetrated. The right engine trailed a ribbon of fire and oily smoke. The left wing showed a jagged hole the size of a dinner plate, and the tail stabilizer hung at an angle that defied every principle of aerodynamics. It should have been falling, tumbling, a meteor of metal and aviation fuel. Instead, it flew with grim determination, nose down, bleeding altitude like a wounded animal limping toward home. Lieutenant Myra Cale had been written off. The intelligence reports said she'd flown into an anti-aircraft trap, that her plane had been torn apart by a ZSU-23-4 hidden in a dried riverbed. They'd even started drafting the posthumous commendation. But Myra Cale hadn't died in that valley. She'd done something else entirely. Something that would force every pilot, every officer, every smirking academy graduate who'd ever doubted her to reconsider everything they thought they knew about survival, skill, and the kind of will it takes to drag a dying machine across 200 miles of hostile territory. The A-10 dropped below the tree line, gear grinding down with a mechanical scream that sounded like agony. Kowalski hit every alarm in the tower. Crash crews scrambled. Foam trucks roared to life. And somewhere in the darkness, a woman who'd been erased from the roster 3 days ago prepared to prove that reports of her death had been, as always, greatly exaggerated. The wheels touched asphalt with a shriek of tortured rubber. Sparks erupted from the right landing gear, which had deployed only halfway, twisted metal scraping concrete at 140 knots. The A-10 slewed sideways, the damaged wing dipping dangerously low, and for one terrible moment it seemed the entire aircraft would cartwheel into the hangars. But Myra compensated, working the rudder pedals with a precision that bordered on supernatural, bleeding off speed through sheer force of will, and a lifetime of muscle memory burned into nerve and sinew. The plane shuddered to a stop 300 yards down the runway, smoke pouring from every surface, the right engine finally dying with a wet cough that sounded almost relieved. Foam crews surrounded it within seconds, drowning the smoldering metal in white chemical clouds. Kowalski watched through binoculars, his hands still trembling, as the canopy cracked open with a hydraulic hiss. Emergency crews rushed forward with ladders, with medical kits, with oxygen masks and stretchers, prepared for the worst. What emerged from that cockpit wasn't broken. Myra Cale climbed down the ladder slowly, deliberately, still wearing her helmet, her flight suit torn and stained with hydraulic fluid and what looked like blood. She waved off the paramedics, pulled the helmet free, and let it hang from her hand. Her face was streaked with soot and exhaustion, eyes ringed with the kind of fatigue that went beyond physical, down into the soul. But she was walking. She was alive. And the way she looked back at that ruined aircraft, one hand resting briefly on its scarred flank, spoke of a bond that transcended metal and mechanics. Colonel Briggs arrived in a jeep that skidded to a halt 20 feet away. He stepped out slowly, disbelief written across every line of his face. He'd signed the casualty report. He'd called her parents. He'd started the process of clearing out her locker. Now here she stood, impossible and undeniable, a ghost made flesh through nothing but competence and bloody-minded refusal to die. "Lieutenant Cale," he said, voice rough with something between anger and awe. "We thought—" She cut him off with a look, those dark eyes meeting his without flinching. "I know what you thought, sir. You thought wrong." There was no accusation in her voice, no bitterness. Just fact delivered with the same cold certainty that had announced her return over the radio. The debriefing would come later. The questions about how she'd evaded 6 surface-to-air missiles, crash-landed in enemy territory, performed field repairs with nothing but a multi-tool and spite, and then flew 200 miles on fumes and prayers. But in that moment, standing on the tarmac as dawn broke pink and gold over the base, everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would become legend. Not because it was impossible, Myra had just proved it wasn't, but because it revealed a truth the military sometimes forgot, that the most dangerous weapon in any arsenal isn't technology or firepower. It's a pilot who refuses to accept that the mission is over. The medical team finally convinced her to sit on the back of an ambulance. They checked her vitals, shined lights in her eyes, wrapped her bleeding hands in gauze. She answered their questions mechanically, distracted, her gaze constantly drifting back to the A-10. That plane had saved her life, and she'd saved its life right back, a mutual pact written in fire and desperation. Someone draped a blanket over her shoulders. Someone else pressed a bottle of water into her hands. But Myra barely noticed. She was already somewhere else, reliving the last 72 hours in flashes of sensory memory, too intense to process all at once. Kowalski approached cautiously, coffee-stained and still shaking. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I need to know, how did you—" He trailed off, unable to finish the question. "How did you survive? How did you fly? How did you make it back?" Myra looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time since landing, something like a smile touched the corner of her mouth. "I had a good teacher," she said, "and a better reason to come home." The base began to wake up around them. Word spread faster than official channels, carried on the whisper network that connects every soldier, every airman, every person who's ever stood on a flight line and watched someone they care about disappear into the sky. Reaper 1 Actual was back. The pilot they'd written off, the woman some of the younger officers had quietly dismissed as competent but nothing special, had just performed a feat of aviation that would be studied in flight schools for decades. And she'd done it without drama, without fanfare, with nothing but the grim professionalism that defined her entire career. They started calling her the ghost before sunset, the pilot who died and came back, the one who dragged her plane home through sheer force of will. But those who knew Myra, really knew her, understood the truth was both simpler and more profound. She'd never left, not in the way that mattered, because Myra Cale had learned a long time ago that survival wasn't about being the strongest or the fastest or the most naturally talented. It was about being too stubborn to quit, too focused to panic, and too professional to let fear make her decisions. 3 days earlier, the mission had been routine. A close air support sortie in the Kandahar Valley, backing up a Marine reconnaissance unit that had stumbled into something uglier than expected. Myra had been flying top cover with her wingman, a cocky captain named Torres who'd graduated top of his class at Pensacola and never let anyone forget it. The morning briefing had flagged possible anti-aircraft activity in the region, but nothing concrete, nothing that would change the mission parameters. They'd been wrong. The ambush was textbook, executed with a precision that spoke of professional military training, not the improvised tactics of insurgent fighters. The Marines on the ground had walked into a kill zone, and when they called for air support, they'd been calling for a lifeline. Myra and Torres had rolled in hot, A-10s diving through broken cloud cover, 30mm cannons already spooling up. The distinctive roar of the GAU-8 Avenger had echoed through the valley, a sound like God clearing his throat before delivering judgment. Torres had hit his targets clean, smoke and fire erupting from enemy positions dug into the hillside. But as he pulled up, trading altitude for speed, the valley had come alive with tracers. Not the random spray of small arms fire, but the concentrated, disciplined fire of multiple ZSU positions that had remained hidden until the aircraft were committed, vulnerable, trapped by terrain and gravity. Myra had seen it developing, had screamed into the radio, "Break left." Torres, break left now. But combat is measured in fractions of seconds, and fractions aren't always enough. The anti-aircraft fire had caught Torres' plane square in the left-wing route. Fuel ignited instantly, a blossom of orange fire that consumed the wing in a heartbeat. Myra had watched, helpless, as Torres ejected, the rocket-propelled seat carrying him clear just before his A-10 disintegrated into a fireball that painted the valley walls in flickering orange light. His parachute had deployed, white silk against blue sky, drifting toward enemy-held territory and whatever fate waited there. The radio had exploded with traffic, ground units screaming for covering fire, the airborne controller demanding status reports, Torres on his survival radio announcing he was down, injured but mobile, already moving to evade. And underneath it all, the cold calculus of combat. Myra was alone, in a valley bristling with anti-aircraft weapons that had just proven they could kill an A-10, with Marines pinned down below and her wingman floating toward capture or death. She'd made her decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. No deliberation, no hesitation, just the instant clarity that comes from years of training and a fundamental understanding of what the mission required. She'd rolled inverted, pushed the stick forward, and dove back into that meat grinder of tracers and explosions, the A-10 screaming earthward at an angle that made every warning system in the cockpit light up in protest. The 30mm cannon had roared again, chewing through enemy positions with depleted uranium rounds that hit like the fist of an angry god. Concrete bunkers exploded. Technical vehicles disintegrated. The anti-aircraft guns that had been tracking her suddenly went silent, their crews either dead or diving for cover. Myra had held the dive until she could see individual faces below, until she could count the bricks in shattered walls, then yanked back on the stick with both hands, pulling so hard that gray tunneled her vision, and the G-forces crushed her down into the seat. The A-10 had bottomed out 20 feet above the valley floor, so low that her wingtips nearly clipped the ruins of an old compound. She'd leveled off, skimming terrain, using the earth itself as cover while she repositioned for another run. Behind her, the Marines had seized the initiative, pushing forward while the enemy was still reeling. And somewhere in the chaos, Tor's survival radio crackled updates. He was moving, heading for an extraction point, buying time one painful step at a time. Myra had set up for her second pass when the missile launch warning screamed in her ears. Someone down there had kept their head, maintained discipline, waited for her to commit before firing. The SA-16 man-portable surface-to-air missile came off the launcher with a dragon's hiss of smoke and fire, tracking her with the relentless precision of modern guidance systems. She'd hit the flare button, dumping countermeasures in a cascade of burning magnesium, thrown the A-10 into a punishing turn that made the airframe groan in protest. The missile had bought the flares, detonating harmlessly 50 yards behind her in a flash of orange light. But there had been a second launcher, a second missile, and this one didn't fall for the countermeasures. It came in low and fast, tracking the A-10's heat signature, and Myra had run out of altitude to maneuver. She'd tried, thrown the plane into a roll that should have been impossible at that speed and elevation, but physics is an unforgiving mistress. The missile had detonated 6 feet from her right wing, proximity fuse detecting metal and triggering the warhead. Shrapnel had peppered the wing and fuselage, a shotgun blast of steel fragments traveling at supersonic speeds. The right engine had taken the worst of it, turbine blades shattering, oil pressure dropping to zero, temperature spiking into the red. Secondary explosions rippled through the engine bay as fuel lines ruptured and caught fire. Every alarm in the cockpit had screamed for attention. Master caution lights blazed. The stick went mushy as hydraulic pressure bled away through severed lines. The A-10 started an uncommanded roll to the right, the damaged wing creating asymmetric lift that wanted to spin her into the ground. Myra had fought it, muscle and instinct overriding the mechanical failure, forcing the plane level through sheer willpower and a lifetime of understanding how these machines thought, moved, died. She'd had maybe 15 seconds to make a decision. Eject and try to evade on foot in the same valley that had just swallowed tours. Attempt to limp back to base on one engine, damaged flight controls and prayers. Or do the insane thing, set the burning plane down right there, in enemy territory, in a valley floor that wasn't designed for landing anything larger than a helicopter. The ground units were screaming at her to get clear, to punch out, that they'd organize a rescue operation. But Myra had looked at her fuel gauge, at the warning lights, at the smoke starting to seep into the cockpit, and made a different calculation. The riverbed looked almost flat from altitude. Almost. She'd lined up on it, dropping gear and flaps that responded sluggishly to her commands, setting up for an approach that would have gotten her failed out of flight school. But flight school didn't prepare you for landing a crippled attack jet in a combat zone with one engine on fire and hostiles closing in from 3 directions. Flight school taught theory. This was survival, raw and immediate. The A-10 had touched down hard, gear slamming into rocks and sand, the whole airframe shuddering with impacts that sounded like artillery fire. She'd kept the nose up as long as possible, bleeding off speed, the tail dragging through dirt and debris. The right landing gear had collapsed immediately, overloaded and damaged, sending the wing scraping across the ground in a shower of sparks and torn metal. The plane had slewed sideways, still moving at 70 knots, and Myra had ridden it out like a bull rider, hands locked on the controls, teeth clenched, every muscle in her body tensed against the violence of uncontrolled deceleration. When the A-10 finally stopped moving, she was alive, conscious, and still strapped into a cockpit that was rapidly filling with acrid smoke. She'd punched the canopy release, felt the explosive bolts fire, cool air flooding in. The silence after the engine noise was profound, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and distant gunfire. Myra had unbuckled with shaking hands, grabbed her survival kit, and climbed out onto the wing, her boots slipping on fuel-slicked metal. The Marines had found her 20 minutes later, a defensive perimeter collapsing inward as they executed a fighting withdrawal with their unexpected guest. They'd stared at her like she was a myth made flesh, this slight woman in a torn flight suit who just crash-landed an attack jet to provide them cover. The staff sergeant leading the unit, a boulder of a man named Rodriguez, had actually laughed, a sound edged with hysteria and relief. "Ma'am," he'd said, "that was the craziest goddamn thing I've ever seen." Myra had just nodded, conserving words, her mind already moving to the next problem. Extraction, survival, getting these Marines home. But extraction hadn't come. Not that day. Not the next. The valley had turned into a hornet's nest of enemy activity, and every attempt to send in rescue helicopters had been driven back by ground fire too intense to penetrate. The Marines had pulled back to a defensive position in the ruins of an old Soviet outpost, setting up fields of fire, rationing ammunition and water, digging in for a siege they might not survive. And Myra had been stuck with them, no longer a pilot but just another rifle on the line, just another body buying time and hopping for miracles. During lulls in the fighting, she kept returning to the crashed A-10. The Marines had thought she was crazy, risking exposure to check on a destroyed aircraft. But Myra saw something they didn't. The plane wasn't dead. Not completely. The left engine still showed compression when she'd manually turned the turbine. The cockpit systems had been protected by that legendary titanium bathtub. The auxiliary power unit, battered but intact, still had enough juice for one more start. And most importantly, the landing gear on the left side was damaged but functional. She'd started working on it the second night, using tools scavenged from the Marines' kits, cutting hydraulic lines and rerouting them, bypassing destroyed systems, cannibalizing parts. Rodriguez had found her elbow deep in the engine bay at 300, flashlight clenched between her teeth, hands bleeding from a dozen small cuts. "Lieutenant," he'd said quietly, "that bird isn't flying again. You need to rest." She'd looked at him, grease-streaked and exhausted, and said 5 words that would haunt him for the rest of his career. "Watch me prove you wrong." For 2 days, while the Marines held off probing attacks and conserved their dwindling ammunition, Myra had performed a miracle of improvised aviation maintenance. She'd sealed fuel leaks with epoxy from the survival kits, straightened control surfaces by hand, using leverage and determination, rewired the electrical system to bypass burned-out sections. She'd worked with a focus that bordered on obsession, sleeping in 15-minute increments, eating MREs without tasting them, every fiber of her being concentrated on a single goal: make this plane fly one more time. The Marines had started to believe on the 3rd day, when she'd powered up the auxiliary unit and the cockpit displays flickered to life. They'd gathered around the A-10 like pilgrims at a shrine, watching this woman methodically test each system, logging failures and successes in a blood-stained notepad. The left engine had coughed, sputtered, then roared to life with a sound that brought tears to Rodriguez's eyes. It was rough, missing on at least 2 cylinders, burning oil at a rate that would have grounded it anywhere with regulations. But it ran. Against all logic, against all reason, Myra Cale had resurrected a dead warplane in a combat zone using nothing but spite and skill. On the morning of the 4th day, enemy forces had massed for a final push. Intelligence intercepted on captured radios indicated they knew about the downed pilot, knew she was still alive, and wanted either a prisoner or a corpse before any rescue could arrive. The Marines prepared for their last stand, checking ammunition counts that wouldn't last another hour of sustained fighting. Rodriguez had approached Myra one final time. "Ma'am, you've done everything possible, more than anyone could ask." "But it's time to accept," she'd cut him off with a shake of her head. "Get your men ready to move, Sergeant. We're leaving in 30 minutes, all of us." They'd thought she meant on foot, some desperate breakout attempt through enemy lines. Instead, Myra had outlined a plan so audacious it crossed the line from bravery into madness and kept going. She would fly out, alone, in an aircraft held together with improvised repairs and prayer. She'd draw the enemy's attention, pull their anti-aircraft assets away from the north side of the valley. And while every gun was pointed at her, the Marines would extract via helicopter to a landing zone that would suddenly, briefly, become viable. "You'll die," Rodriguez had said flatly. "That plane can't sustain combat. One hit and it's over." Myra had met his eyes, and in that moment he'd seen something that made him understand why they called her Reaper. Not because she was death incarnate, but because she understood death intimately, had looked it in the face so many times that fear had been burned away, leaving only cold professional competence. "Then make my death count, Sergeant. Get your Marines home." The takeoff had been an act of faith. The riverbed wasn't long enough, wasn't smooth enough, wasn't anything approaching a proper runway. But Myra had lined up the A-10, pointed it at the only gap in the surrounding ridges and pushed the throttle forward. The single engine had screamed, turbofan blades spinning up to maximum RPM, and the aircraft had started rolling, slow at first, gathering speed with agonizing reluctance. The makeshift repairs groaned under stress. The patched fuel lines wept liquid that streamed back over the wing. But the A-10 accelerated, eating up riverbed, rocks pinging off the titanium belly. She'd rotated at the last possible second, hauling back on the stick, and the plane had clawed into the air with maybe 50 feet of clearance between the nose and the ridgeline. It had been flying more on momentum and determination than aerodynamics, but flying nonetheless, gaining altitude one painful foot at a time. Behind her, Rodriguez had watched with tears streaming down his face, already calling in the extraction birds, already counting down the seconds until his Marines could live or die based on what this impossible woman could accomplish. The enemy had reacted exactly as predicted. Every anti-aircraft gun in the valley had swiveled toward the departing A-10, tracers arcing up like deadly fireworks. Myra had jinked and weaved, pushing the damaged plane through maneuvers that made warning lights cascade across her instrument panel. She dumped her remaining flares, fired chaff, done everything possible to present a target too tempting to ignore. And it had worked. For 7 crucial minutes, every enemy combatant in the valley had been focused on killing her, convinced they could finish what they'd started days before. In that window, the extraction helicopters had come in fast and low from the north, rotors beating the air, door gunners already laying down suppressive fire. The Marines had sprinted for the birds, carrying their wounded, dragging their gear, every second precious. Rodriguez had been the last man aboard, and as the helicopter lifted off, banking hard away from the valley, he looked back to see that disappearing over the southern ridge. Still flying, still fighting, trailing smoke like a banner of defiance. Myra had made it 15 miles before the patched fuel line finally let go completely. She'd watched the gauge drop from critical to empty in under a minute, the engine coughing as it starved, windmilling to a stop. The silence had been absolute, broken only by the whistle of wind over the canopy and the creak of stressed metal. She traded altitude for distance, gliding the A-10 like an enormous, ugly glider, scanning the terrain below for anything approaching a suitable landing zone. She'd found a highway, arrow straight, cutting through the hills like a promise. It was in nominally friendly territory, though friendly was a relative term in this region. But it was flat, it was long, and it was her only option. The A-10 had dropped like a stone in those final moments, gravity reasserting its dominance now that thrust was gone. Myra had lined up on the highway, fought the crosswind with ailerons that barely responded, and brought the plane down in a wheels-up landing that tore away the belly, and sent up a rooster tail of sparks visible for miles. She'd slid to a stop in a screech of tortured metal, head ringing from the impact, every bruise and cut from the last 4 days suddenly screaming for attention. But alive. Still alive. She'd climbed out of the cockpit on shaking legs, looked at the ruined A-10 one last time and started walking north, toward the radio beacon she could hear calling in her survival equipment. Toward home, however distant that might be. It had taken another day to reach friendly forces, moving through territory where alliances shifted like sand and survival meant trusting no one completely. She'd walked through the night, navigated by stars and the faint glow of distant bases on the horizon, one foot in front of the other, refusing to stop until she reached safety. A patrol had found her at dawn, dehydrated and exhausted but still moving, still refusing to quit. They'd radioed ahead, confirmed her identity, and suddenly the entire theater knew Reaper 1 Actual was alive. The ride back to base had been surreal, soldiers staring at her with mixture of awe and disbelief, officers pressing water bottles into her hands, asking questions she was too tired to answer. And Myra had sat in the back of the transport, watching the landscape roll by, thinking about Torres still missing, about Rodriguez and his Marines hopefully safe, about the A-10 she'd left scattered across 100 miles of hostile territory. Now, sitting on the ambulance bumper with dawn breaking over the base, she let herself feel it all. The exhaustion, the fear she'd suppressed for 4 days, the grief for Torres whose fate was still unknown. Medical personnel buzzed around her, but Myra barely noticed. She was watching the sun come up, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and thinking about all the sunrises she might never have seen. About all the pilots who didn't make it home, whose luck ran out or whose skill wasn't quite enough, or who just happened to be in the wrong place when physics and probability converged. Colonel Briggs sat down beside her, careful not to crowd, giving her space to breathe. For a long moment neither spoke. Then quietly, "We lost Torres." Myra closed her eyes. She'd known on some level, had known the moment his chute deployed over enemy territory, but knowing and hearing were different things. "They found him?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. Briggs nodded. "Marine Patrol recovered his body yesterday. He didn't suffer, it was quick." It was the lie officers told, the kindness they afforded the living. But Myra accepted it, filed it away with all the other losses, all the other prices paid. The Marines you covered are stateside, Briggs continued. Rodriguez and his whole unit, they're writing you up for a medal. Hell, half the command staff is writing you up for medals. What you did, he stopped, searching for words adequate to the moment. What you did is going to be taught at every war college, every flight school. You understand that? Myra opened her eyes, looked at him directly. I understand it doesn't bring tours back, sir. The colonel had no response to that truth. They sat together as the base woke fully, as the morning rush of aircraft and personnel began. Maintenance crews descended on the damaged A-10, already taking measurements, photographing damage, beginning the forensic analysis that would determine whether the airframe could be salvaged or if it had given its last full measure. Myra watched them work, these anonymous technicians who kept the machines flying, whose skill and dedication made everything else possible. One of them caught her eye, gave her a thumbs up. She nodded back, acknowledging the silent kinship. By mid-morning, the story had spread beyond the base, carried on news wires and military channels to every corner of the command structure. Senators called for briefings. Generals demanded detailed reports. The media, always hungry for heroes, began crafting narratives about the pilot who wouldn't die, who flew a destroyed aircraft home through skill and determination. But the people who really mattered, the pilots and crew chiefs and ground troops who understood what Myra had actually done, they told a different story. They spoke about competence under pressure, about the kind of professionalism that doesn't crack when everything goes to hell, about trust, in the machine, in the mission, in yourself. Myra's squadron mates found her in the medical bay, where doctors had finally convinced her to submit to a thorough examination. They crowded into the room, these pilots who'd flown with her, fought beside her, mourned her supposed death. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The squadron commander, a taciturn captain named Volkov, simply placed a hand on her shoulder and squeezed once. It said everything. Welcome home, we're glad you made it, we're sorry about tours, we're proud of you, we understand. Myra covered his hand with her own, accepting the connection, letting herself be part of the tribe again. The debriefing came that afternoon once the doctors reluctantly cleared her. Myra sat in a conference room surrounded by senior officers, intelligence analysts, and a stenographer recording every word. She walked them through it chronologically, clinically, leaving emotion out of the narrative. The ambush, Tor's death, the crash landing, the siege, the resurrection of her aircraft, the extraction cover, the second crash, the walk home. She answered their questions precisely, drawing diagrams when words weren't enough, explaining tactical decisions with the clarity of someone who'd had 4 days to review every choice. But they kept coming back to one question, asked a dozen different ways. How did you do it? How did you repair that aircraft with field supplies? How did you fly it out on one engine? How did you survive 4 days in enemy territory? And Myra gave them the only answer she had, the one that wouldn't satisfy their desire for some revelation, some secret that could be bottled and distributed. I did what needed doing with what I had available because the alternative was unacceptable. General Hammond, watching from the back of the room, smiled at that answer. He was old school, a Vietnam veteran who'd flown A-4 Skyhawks when pilots still dropped bombs by eye and prayed the flak didn't find them. He understood what Myra was saying, even if the younger officers didn't. There was no secret, no trick. Just competence refined through repetition, confidence built on foundations of success and failure both, and the fundamental understanding that survival wasn't about extraordinary moments but ordinary excellence maintained under extraordinary pressure. The session broke at 1800 hours. Myra stepped out into the evening air, her body aching despite the painkillers, her mind still churning through details and decisions. She should have gone to her quarters, should have slept for the next 12 hours. Instead, her feet carried her back to the flight line, to where the damaged A-10 sat surrounded by maintenance stands and diagnostic equipment. The crew working on it looked up as she approached, and something unspoken passed between them. This was sacred ground. this space where machine and pilot had become something more than the sum of their parts. The crew chief, a master sergeant named Liu with 30 years under her belt, walked over. She held out a twisted piece of metal, blackened and scarred. "Found this in the engine bay," Liu said. "Shrapnel from the missile hit. Should have torn through the fuel system, should have turned the whole aircraft into a fireball. But it embedded in a hydraulic accumulator instead, just missed everything vital by about 3 millimeters." She handed it to Myra. "Thought you might want it. To remember how lucky you are." Myra turned the metal over in her hands, feeling its weight. But when she spoke, her voice was soft, thoughtful. "It's not luck, Master Sergeant. It's design. Some engineer at Fairchild Republic spent months calculating redundancies, mapping out systems so that no single point of failure could kill the aircraft. This plane kept flying because brilliant people I'll never meet built it to survive. And every maintainer who ever torqued a bolt correctly, every inspector who caught a crack before it propagated, every person in the chain who did their job right contributed to me being alive. That's not luck. That's competence, all the way down." Liu was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Guess I never thought about it that way." Myra smiled, tired but genuine. "I think about it all the time. Every time I strap in, I'm trusting thousands of people I've never met, and they're trusting me to bring their work home intact, to honor what they built by flying it right." She handed the shrapnel back. "Keep that. Put it somewhere the junior maintainers can see it. Remind them that attention to detail saves lives. That there's no such thing as an unimportant job." The story that emerged in the following weeks was bigger than Myra, bigger than one mission gone sideways and survived through skill. It became a touchstone, a reference point, the thing old pilots pointed to when young pilots got cocky. It was proof that the fundamentals mattered, that flashy maneuvers and academy rankings meant nothing compared to solid airmanship and the ability to keep your head when everything was on fire. Flight schools added her mission profile to their curriculum, not as an example of extraordinary skill, but as a case study in decision-making under pressure. But for Myra, life continued much as it had before. She flew her assigned sorties, maintained her proficiency, mentored newer pilots who came to her with questions they were afraid to ask their instructors. She didn't talk much about those 4 days, didn't cultivate the legend that had grown around her call sign. When pressed, she'd redirect to Tours, making sure his name stayed in the conversation, ensuring his death wasn't overshadowed by her survival. That more than anything earned her respect, the refusal to let her story eclipse his sacrifice. She visited Tor's parents 6 months later when she was stateside on leave. They lived in a small house in New Mexico, and they greeted her at the door with tears and questions and desperate need to understand how their son had died. Myra had sat with them for hours, telling them everything, the truth unvarnished. She told them about Tor's skill, his professionalism, his sacrifice that had bought time for the ground units. She told them he'd been a good wingman, that she'd trusted him completely. And when Tor's mother asked if he'd suffered, Myra had looked her in the eye and lied. "No, ma'am. It was quick. He didn't feel anything." Some truths were too heavy for parents to carry. The nightmares.